We're going to review over some CSS basics, and I like to start with the terminology piece, which is also connected to the syntax, right? But how are we labeling the different parts of our CSS? This is really important when we think about testing, right? There's a question and there's some code there. We need to be able to identify these terms that they use in the question so we know which part of the code that we're looking at. So first, let's start off with our properties. And these are the features or the characteristics. Basically, these are the descriptive things. Whatever synonym we want to use, right? These are the things that we want to be able to change. The value is how we're changing them. So this is how we're going to handle that feature. Now, these always come in pairs. And when they are paired, we call that pair a declaration. So we have a property here, our background color, separated by a colon, and then we have the value. They are always paired. There's always a property, a colon, and a value. And then we call this the declaration when we have the two pieces paired together. Then we have to decide what are we applying this to in our document. For that, we're going to use our selector. So the selector defines the HTML element to which we're going to apply this CSS. And when we put all of this together, a selector plus our declarations, we call the whole thing a rule. So this here is an example of a rule. We have a selector. The selector is selecting P, paragraph elements, all paragraph elements. And then we have a set of curly brackets. Within there, we have a property of color, and that color has a value of blue. So we're saying make all of the text blue. Okay, so big picture here. The whole thing is called a rule. Within the rule, then we have the selector. What are we choosing to apply this CSS to? Followed by these curly braces. And everything inside the curly braces is the declaration block. Just means it's the collection of all the declarations we're using. So in this specific example, we have two declarations. Here's the first one. Remember, a declaration is a property plus a value. The color is blue. We have a second declaration. The text align is set to justify the property and the value. Then we want to think about what are the different ways that we can select things. So when we use this word selector, we just mean that we want to connect our CSS to our HTML. And we want to be very specific. We want to connect this CSS to this HTML object. So all of our CSS rules are going to be specific for one type of object. And there's three main types of selectors that we use. The first is the one that we've seen so far. This is what we would call a tag selector. I sometimes see it called an element selector, and that terminology may fit a little bit better for you with the HTML. But basically, we're selecting all elements of a particular type. And now these have to be elements that exist in the HTML language. We cannot make anything up here. So we, for example, here are selecting all heading 3s. We're selecting all paragraphs. We're selecting all images. So anything that already exists in the HTML language, we just list the name of that element here in our CSS code. The second type of selector is our class selector. Now, the class selector, we're going to have to come up and name it, and then we can apply that name as many times as we want to as many different types of elements that we want. So whereas the tag selector could only target one particular element at a time, a class selector can be applied to multiple different types of elements. So if we look at the CSS piece, we know it's a class because it begins with a period in our CSS, a dot, and then we name it whatever we want to name it. We're going to come up with this. Then when we want to apply it into our HTML, we're going to apply it with a class attribute and set that class attribute to the same name that we've given our CSS class. So the way we know does that class apply is we have to see class equals note. And again, it can be to any element, any number of elements that we want to apply it to. It's intended to be used multiple times. Our third type of selector is similar in concept, but it is intended to only be used once per page. It's an ID selector, and it's a unique identifier. So in our CSS, we don't have a dot, now we have the pound sign. So that is our ID character, and then we're going to name it. Just like a class selector, we are making up this name, any name we want to give it. And then when we apply it, if you'll notice here, this is a little bit different. We're still applying it to the HTML element as an attribute, but we need to use the ID attribute. So if I see just the CSS and I'm wondering where does it apply, I'm going to look for ID equals main idea. If you show me any CSS class and ask me where does it apply, I'm going to look for class equals whatever the name of that class was. So make note of the characters that we use, the period versus the pound sign, and also how we're applying them to the HTML itself. We're using a class attribute versus the ID attribute. Both are very distinctive. So now that we can create our CSS, the next question we have to ask is where do we want to use that CSS? So there's 3 different ways that we can use CSS. The first is through an external style sheet. This would apply to every page of a website. It's fantastic for creating consistency from page to page. You manage one copy, you can make that update one time, and it just applies to all the pages of the whole website. So if we're going to create an external style sheet, within the head of our HTML document, we're going to use the link element, and that link tells it where is the style sheet that we are linking to. And then all of the CSS would be in this separate style sheet file itself. There would be no other CSS in the page, in the HTML page. It would all be in this CSS file. We might also, though, want to apply styles to just one page of a website. Maybe we don't want it to every page. We want it to one page. So if we want to do that, it's done through what we might call an embedded or an internal style sheet. And this means our styles go directly within the head section of our HTML document. So within the head section, we would have our style tags. This creates the embedded or internal style sheet. And then we can put in whatever styles we want within that style tag. Our third way is through using inline styles. With inline styles, we're going to apply our CSS inside of the body part of the HTML document to one specific element. So this specific button is what I'm applying it to. My inline style is then applied as an attribute. So here's my style attribute, and within that attribute, I'm putting the CSS declaration. We still have the property and the value pair with a colon. Remember, we always have that. But now I'm putting it here as the style attribute. So the final idea we want to think about with this, we have 3 different ways that we can apply CSS. Which one wins if they're all battling for the same thing? So that's the idea of both inheritance and precedence. Which one wins? So the one that will always win is our inline style. It always wins. It will override both an embedded style sheet and an external style sheet. Next is the embedded style sheet. It will always override the external. So the external is always going to be the biggest loser. Okay, so let's look at an example. I've got some code here, and we're going to look just at images, and specifically at the widths that these images would show up at based upon the various places where we have some CSS defined. So first we have an external style sheet, and we don't see the code, but go with me here. In here, all images are set to a width of 900 pixels. Next, we have an embedded style sheet, and it's setting all images to a width of 300 pixels. So which of these wins? If we stop right here and our external says 900, our internal says 300, look back up here. Which one's going to win? The embedded's going to win. So already the 900 is not going to apply to this page because of the internal style sheet. So then let's keep looking down a little further. We've got 3 images. Our first image here has a source, it has an alt. There are no inline styles. So this image is going to display 300 pixels based again on that internal style sheet. Our second image, we've still got the source and the alt, but now we have inline CSS. This always wins. So this specific image is going to display at 500 pixels because the inline overrides the embedded internal style sheet. And then our final image, just like the first, does not have the inline styles, so it also will be 300 pixels. It can get a little confusing when we're looking at a lot of conflicting CSS like this, but if we can remember the order of precedence, inline wins. Next comes the internal style sheet. Very last is the external. Then we know where we're looking, and we can start looking in the right place to see what's actually going to apply to the page. Well, I hope this helped to review some of the basics of CSS. Please don't hesitate to reach out to your instructor if you have any questions.